Welcome to Recalibrate Reality, the future of New York. Our guest today is Christine Quinn, the president and CEO of WIN, the largest provider of family shelter and supportive housing in New York City. Christine is also the former speaker of the New York City Council, which means she's an expert on how city government works. We had a wide-ranging discussion about an issue that has plagued our city for far too long, homelessness. And so now, let's recalibrate reality with Christine Quinn. Christine, welcome to Recalibrate Reality. It's great having you here.
Thank you.
So, I'd like to start, you have this extraordinary career in public service, and now you're president and CEO of WIN, which is the largest provider of family shelter and supportive housing in New York City. And so before we even get started, can you just take 2 minutes and give us a feel for what WIN does and what you're doing with WIN?
Sure. As you said, WIN is the largest provider of shelter and permanent supportive housing to homeless families in New York City. We house 10% of all of the homeless families every night in New York City. And, most people think homelessness in New York City is about single men. Why? Because that's who's on the cover of the newspaper when homelessness gets covered. But actually, 65 to 70% of everyone in shelter is a family with children. So at WIN, we see our job not just as housing people temporarily, but as ending the homeless crisis in New York City. So we provide, yes, the services the city contracts us to provide, but we also provide a larger number of holistic wraparound services that we call the way to win, that we believe really will give our clients what they need to not just get into permanent housing, but to not return to shelter. Because I really think that's the metric that determines whether you're succeeding, is whether or not people come back time and time again.
It's the old saying, right? You could give someone a fish or you could teach them how to fish. So, you made the point, and I think it's the correct one, which is that as people think about homeless people, they think about the people you see on the streets, right? And as we've lived through COVID, it's taken a problem that has pre-existed in New York, and homelessness has been a crisis that we've had for many, many years through 20 years of different mayors seeing an increase in homelessness. But it's all of a sudden become the front page of the paper, right? When people think about quality of life in New York, they talk about public safety. They talk about the amount of homelessness on the street. And you have a unique perspective because not only of your current role at WIN, but being city council for 13 years and being the speaker for I think 7 of those years, right? So you have this perspective. So I'd like to get your take is, how do we think about is there a solution to help solve this homelessness problem? Because people just keep saying it's there, it feels large, it feels something that is not addressable, but there must be some solution. You must have some real insights to that.
Absolutely. And I believe there are solutions. And we have to start at the beginning. Since the homeless crisis really began, you're right, it's decades, right? And New York City is, I think, the only jurisdiction, but let's say one of the only jurisdictions in the country where it is by law required to house the homeless. That's why we get contracts from the city. They contract out to groups like WIN. But the city's philosophy, and not just Mayor de Blasio's, it's gone on for a long, long time, even when I was in government, the philosophy has been to manage the homeless crisis, not to end the homeless crisis. So your goal determines your actions, right? So in this case, the goal to manage has us in this, mishigash of a system we have now versus one where the goal was to end the crisis. And you talked about give a fish, learn how to fish. In the contracts we have with the city, there are no resources for job training or job placement. We call it income building. Our income building program, which gets moms work, we raise that money privately because the most significant factor which determines success, living independently is a job that can pay the rent. 25 to 30% of the moms, when they come to shelter, are working. They're working and they can't pay the rent. We get that over 50%, closer to 60%, because that's what's necessary to really succeed. And we have those who are working, get them out of fast food, into, other good paying jobs. And I think that's one really clear example of how managing versus ending has created a system which isn't giving homeless people what they need, or non-homeless New Yorkers what they need. The other thing is, and we do families, so I don't really usually speak a lot about single homeless people, but let me just for a second. We have mental health issues amongst family homeless. Of course, you think of a mom ending up in a shelter with her kids, may have been domestic violence, sexual abuse, et cetera. You're going to have mental health issues, right? You'd be crazy if you didn't. But in the single system, the mental health issues are off the charts. And they're not kind of episodic in response to something. They're chronic and they are persistent. But yet the providers of single shelter do not get the resources that they really need to have comprehensive psychiatric services or to contract with a hospital to provide them. It's as if we built a hospital to treat cancer and didn't put a cancer wing in the hospital. That's what we're doing in the shelters right now. And that the next mayor can change.
So maybe to sum up what you said and make sure we're on this, because I think it's an important insight. So in the concept of not managing but solving falls down to two buckets. People that have the potential, give them the skills and tools to be able to earn a living and then be able to afford shelter and be sustainable. And then for the people with mental illness, provide them with the care they need so that they can get better and then move on to the next phase.
Or if they can't get better, we put them in a situation where they will be cared for.
Right, where they be cared for.
That is exactly right. The one piece, you've got it exactly right, piece I would add to that, the children. Our contracts are about what's technically called the head of household, which 92% of the time is a mom in the case of WIN. We aren't contracted to serve the children. But for anyone, but particularly a child, being in shelter is a trauma. That's after the trauma potentially of eviction or domestic violence. 80% of the moms at WIN say they are survivors of domestic violence. And if 80% say it, it's really 100. That's after the trauma of poverty, et cetera, et cetera. The key factor that leads to somebody being a homeless adult is being a homeless child. If we're not treating that trauma, it will fester and it will grow, and that child will have a dysfunctional, unfulfilled life. So at WIN, we have special services for our children. For example, our child care is run in consultation with Bank Street College, so we can deliver trauma-informed care to the little ones in a way that helps them start to address what they've been through. We also have a Camp WIN that's a STEAM-based camp every summer, but every school break, because nobody's going skiing. And we need to make sure our children are somewhere safe and continuing to learn. But that's not part of what's baked into the system.
So there's 50,000 people in New York City that are in shelters, homeless people in shelters, and there's maybe tens of thousands more on the street. And so it sounds like what you're doing at WIN is a great model. Is that model something that is scalable? And is the shelter system today the right approach to doing that?
Well, let me talk about the second question first. Is the shelter system of today the right model? No, it's not the right model. And it's not the right model in a couple of ways. One, we're not giving the providers the resources they need to provide. We're not requiring the correct services. Two, we right now have, yes, homeless shelters throughout the city, which nobody wants. No mayor wants to say, I'm bringing you homeless shelters. But we also, though, don't have enough homeless shelter beds. So we put families into hotels. Think all-time welfare hotels.
Right.
There might be a half a social worker if you're lucky, but there's not case managers, housing coordinators, income building specialists, MSWs like at Wynn. There isn't 24-hour security. There isn't CCTV. A few years ago, a woman and her son were placed at a Holiday Inn in Staten Island. The boyfriend found her and killed them. That is what can happen when you're put in a hotel. What else happens when you're put in a hotel is you languish and you don't get the services that you need. Now, does that mean maybe opening some more shelters? Maybe. But let's focus on getting people out of shelter more quickly so we can have more beds. When I got to Wynn about 5 years ago, the average length of stay in the shelter at Wynn was 11 months. It's now 15 months before COVID. Why? Because the door out, housing that they can afford is not as wide as it used to be. One of the main tools a homeless person uses to get housing is a housing voucher that'll pay 70% of the rent. They pay 30% of their income towards the rent. The voucher would pay the rest right now up to $1,551 for a family of four. Zillow did a report for us. There is literally no neighborhood in the city of New York, none, where the median area rent is $1,551. And so we're giving people vouchers, giving them a piece of hope, but it's really hopeless because They can't get them an apartment. So we have legislation in the city council that Chairperson Steve Levin is carrying. We have over 40 sponsors that would raise the amount of the voucher to the Section 8 level, which is about $2,200. We would then get people out of the shelter, open up beds, get out of the hotels, right? And hopefully not have to open a lot more shelters throughout the city. The mayor opposes this piece of legislation because he says it's too expensive. Let me give you some numbers. Right now, it's $201 a night to stay in one of our shelters. It's $272 a night to stay in a hotel. It's $73 a night with the increased amount of money to use a voucher. So, yeah, not the first second, but you are going to save money and you're going to get out of the hotel. So, yeah, you have to invest a little bit, but you will see the rewards and the dividends. And that speaks to a long-term vision. You know, too often mayors, and I know this from when I did budgets as a council member and speaker, you're only looking at the budget you're in. The mayor should be looking at the budgets that'll happen by, that the next mayor will be doing.
Right. So it's really not necessarily the fact that it's a shelter or a hotel. It's the fact that the shelter or hotels that are housing the homeless people don't have the level of support, the level of programming, the level of public safety and security that give them the ability then to move forward. Right. So it's not necessarily the hotel itself, but that's the issue with it. You
could make a hotel. We've taken at Wynn a number of times, maybe 4 or 5 hotels, and converted them into shelters. Technically, what we're called is a tier 2 shelter. We've done that a number of times. I mean, physically, the structures can work well. You have to put kitchens in. Sometimes if it's like, an executive stay hotel, they already have the kitchen. So that can work well.
Right. And I think, right now, if you think about it, there's an excess amount of empty hotels because of the COVID downturn that could be adopted for or Section 8 housing to be able to provide that next level of housing that comes through.
And that's so much, absolutely. And that is so much faster than building from the ground up.
Right.
Because one of the challenges with creating affordable housing, and I'm all for creating more affordable housing that my clients can afford and people of all different levels, but to tell you, it takes a long time to build something in New York. I have, a new sense of compassion for builders that I didn't have when I was in government. It's ridiculous. But the hotels there, all you have to do is, some level of rehab, and they'll be much, much quicker. And what we need is a level of speed as it relates to the homeless crisis.
Yeah, it's interesting. You homeless shelters or even really low income affordable housing are hot button issues for any community. Even in my community. Downtown, there a homeless shelter for women. A woman homeless shelter was being set up. A very reputable firm was managing it, and all of a sudden we were getting flyers of people opposing it. And probably a lot of those people that are opposing it probably support WIN and other organizations like WIN. But when it's in their backyard, they oppose it. So part of this needs to be, an educational process to say, listen, we're all part of the solution. If they're going to be in our community, we should welcome to the community. We should try to be part of the solution to that, helping with some of the ability to, provide support and programming and engagement with the people that live there to help them move forward.
Absolutely. We opened a shelter, and very soon we'll be opening a second one in the South Slope, Park Slope, Gowanus area. And you would think that's a neighborhood, right, that would have been totally arms open. Not completely. But, you have to be willing to, and we went and got yelled at and screamed at. At some point, I screamed back because I don't want to scream at me, but they were screaming at my staff, and that I just won't, what I abide by. You know me, I'm a little bit of a scream. Anyway, you have to be willing to do that. And sometimes government isn't, right? Sometimes government is like, no, this is just what we're doing. No, you have to go and get yelled at. And you have to go and answer all of the questions with the real answers, good, bad, ugly, whatever they are. Ended up a lovely neighborhood group called Citizen Squirrel. I'm not really sure what the name's about. Sprung up. They started coming to the meetings with their children, holding signs. And then when we opened, they made welcome wagon packets for the moms and the kids. So that really, can happen. Now, in that meeting, and this is an important issue too, they raised concerns about not that homeless kids were going to go to the school, but a lot more kids very quickly were going to go to the school. And the school was a good school, but underfunded. So WIN, worked with Councilmember Lander and the superintendent, the principal, et cetera, to try to get more resources. And I think that's a message for providers to hear too. You have to be part of the community in every way.
Right. And that's exactly right. I mean, the way to do these things, it's got to be a partnership. And the more you can, and just like anything you said, it's hard to be a developer. You're learning, you feel sympathetic. The way to be successful at that is being engaged with the community, hearing what they're concerned about, being transparent, having the back and forth, and building a sense of trust. And then it becomes something that you then move forward together with whatever compromises you need to make.
It's funny you should say that, because we're opening very soon a shelter in Coney Island, and I forget how many floors it is, but we were at the community meeting, and somebody from the community said, well, it isn't going to be let's say it's 11 stories. And it was exactly that number of stories.
Right. And not that it would have made a difference if it was 9 or 13 either, right? It's just that's the number.
We were like, well, yes, in fact, it's exactly that number of stories.
So, you mentioned affordable housing, right? Which is the next way to progress here is you need to have housing that people can afford to live in. And so, one of the things that we've dealt with a lot in our communities is trying to build affordable housing in the different developments that we're building. And it's been amazing to me how much demand there is and how little supply. Yeah. We built a project in Brooklyn, and we had 110 affordable units in it. We had 60,000 applications for those 110 units. And so it just shows you how imbalanced it is. So it's a challenge. From your city council days, what are some of in your minds, the short-term actions that we can do to help address this, affordability crisis? And I know we have affordability at all different levels, but I'm talking really now at the level of people that are, at that lower income bracket.
Right. I mean, it's interesting you say that, because when my first job in New York City back in the late 80s was doing housing and tenant organizing. And back then, if I said affordable housing, people would have assumed I meant homeless, very low income. Now you say it, and you could mean, the mythical school teacher and,
Right.
firefighter who can't find an apartment. Look, for our population, a critical piece is more supportive housing. And more real estate developers of a certain stature, a better stature, are stepping forward to want to develop supportive housing, which is really great in my opinion, because it gives me confidence about the quality of buildings. And just to have more players means more is happening. And both Mayor de Blasio and Governor Cuomo have been incredibly supportive of supportive housing. And that's permanent housing, but with services on site. And about 30 to 40% of homeless families will only make it, so to speak, if they're in support. Now, for the rest of the housing, we need to make sure, going back to council days and legislation the council passed, I guess, a year or a year and a half ago, there needs to be requirements in buildings about how much, about units being set aside for homeless level folks. Having a higher voucher will help with those set asides for homeless folks. But what I also think is needed, both for folks who would move into, like, let's say, the set asides in one of your developments, or who's living, in an apartment they found on their own, is what I would call aftercare. Because, living on your own is hard if you've never done it. Most of the families, when they come to us, have been in unstable living conditions for a long time. So you might have somebody in their 30s who, by no fault of their own, never paid a rent bill, never paid Con Ed, et cetera. The stress of getting your medications, et cetera. So if we had social workers who, whether it's a year, 2 years, were working with people, checking on them, I think we would have a lower return to shelter rate. I also think for developers who are nervous about having homeless families in their buildings, which I understand, that would give a greater sense of calm. At WIN, we do a survey every year. Crazy, we can't get data from the city, so we do a hand tabulation. But the last year we did it, 91% of the families we had moved out of shelter were still a year later out of shelter, which I'm very, very proud of. But I think aftercare would help get the whole system at that kind of a level. And look, the issue of having more set-asides for homeless folks, that's going to mean subsidies. And that has to just be built into the budget. There's no question about it.
I was going to ask you that, right? Because that's the same thing I imagine for supportive housing. You can't, for the cost of land and construction in places like New York City, to be able to build supportive housing or housing for people that are coming out of homeless shelters, it's not going to be affordable without subsidies, right?
No, there's no question. You know what I mean? That's just a mathematical fact. And we can spend the money in a shelter, or we can spend the money in a subsidy for affordable housing. It's up to us. Let's think about what's more humane, what's better for that child, and what actually puts people in a position where they're more likely to be able to succeed at work.
Right. Well, to your point, it's managing it or solving it, right? So
correct. Right.
that's what I think is one of the our biggest affordable housing projects in New York is NYCHA, right, where we have over 500,000 residents living, and the conditions, as you know, have been horrific and continue to seem to get worse and worse every year. And so as you think about NYCHA and those deteriorating conditions, whether it's the lead challenges or the rodents or not having hot water, what is that something that is contributing to the problem, or is that part of the solution as people move away from homelessness and have a place to live?
NYCHA, for one of our clients, is the holy grail. They want to be, as bad as it is, they want to be in NYCHA more than they want to be in private housing. Reduces their fear of eviction. It's permanent, even though other things are, vouchers, the voucher doesn't expire anymore, but it's to them permanent. So as bad as it is, it's where they want to be, which is a huge statement, in my opinion. So it is part of the solution right now. It can become more of the solution out there, but we also cannot accept that the solution is such a mess and so unsafe in so many ways. And I'm sure NYCHA is complicated, but we just put a rover on Mars. You know what I'm saying? It can't be more complicated than that.
Right. No. So with NYCHA, do they have the supportive housing equivalents or social work support that you're talking about, or when people go, they're left sort of on their own to make it through NYCHA?
They're left on their own, but many NYCHAs have settlement houses in them, or community groups in them, or very close by. So, you know, I live in Chelsea. So in the Elliott Chelsea houses, Hudson Guild, which is a community organization, a settlement house, is literally physically in the development. In the Fulton houses, which are further down on 9th Avenue, the senior center is in the Fulton houses. So if we were to just put some thought in it, think creatively, those are not exceptions, what I just said. They're much more of the rule. We could easily create something that would also be a benefit to other residents as well. Some of the housing authorities, before being speaker, I was health committee chair. Some of the NYCHA buildings actually had health clinics in them back in the day.
Right. Well, I tell you, it's encouraging to hear some of the experiences that you've gone through and some of the solutions that seem so obvious. But I think one of the challenges when you listen to the solutions, as you alluded to a couple of times, is the budget, right? So if you're thinking about, we have the homeless people that are on the street that have mental illness that need to be cared for. We have the homeless people that are fortunate enough to be in a shelter but need to be in shelters with the support and ability to be aided to move on in a way that's sustainable and stay out of the shelter. What do you think? I mean, roughly, what do you think a budget amount, an infusion in the budget to address this homelessness problem once and for all would need to be?
I don't think it's going to be that much more, because for a couple of reasons. One, because paying for the voucher is less. The housing voucher is less than paying for a night in shelter or a night in a hotel. So you're going to save money there, probably not in year one, but say more in year 3 and 4 and 5. And then those funds could be redirected for psychiatric services or job training or whatever. The other thing we've never done is utilize all of the resources in New York City as it relates to homelessness. In New York City, we train more doctors in, internships and residents than any other city in the country. Why aren't we engaging those medical interns and residents, the psychiatric ones, or the ones who are, on rotation before they've picked their specialty? Why aren't we engaging them through our great hospitals or through the Health and Hospitals Corporation to implement a special program for the homeless in the shelters? It would be, I think, probably once in a lifetime training, but also a great resource for us, just as one example.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the common themes that have come up in these conversations that we're having at Recalibrate Reality is leveraging the private sector to work with the public sector to solve these problems. And that's a good example. And you almost could think about, a whole core of people, from whether it's real estate developers to social workers to healthcare providers to job training, that are volunteering in a coordinated way to help solve some of the problems as you go through this.
Let me give you an example. We had the prior president of Pepsi, Indra Nooyi, spend 2 hours. So in the morning, we had all these women from Pepsi do one-on-one job counseling, job, mentoring with our mothers. We had a clothes company donate dresses, pocketbooks, and shoes, interview clothes. Then we had the mentoring. Then Indra came for 2 hours, spoke, and did questions and answers with our mother. mean, our mother. She's an immigrant, right? First woman to head a big company. So that's just one example. If it wasn't for the private sector, we would not exist at WIN. And I think sometimes the private sector becomes a bad word lately. And are there things that big companies do that are terrible? Absolutely. But there's also great resources there that when they're harnessed can make a big difference.
Yeah, well, I would say that's another theme that's come up in these conversations, that in a post-COVID world, that you need bold solutions and try new policies and new approaches that have never been tried before. And I think we have a clean slate for it, right? Because we're coming off of such a challenging period where so many things have been exacerbated, like homelessness, in this environment, that people are going to say, okay, if we're going to have to deal with it, we have to deal with it head on. And I think one of the things that is, at least for me, gives me comfort is that it sounds like what you built at WIN is a great model.
Thank you.
That can be expanded, and that even from a financial standpoint, if you could lay this roadmap out, maybe it's a one-time infusion to make this transition to more about solving the problem versus managing the problem as you described it, and dealing with creating the right mental health care system and support that's needed for those that can't move on, and that would go a long way. So that's really inspiring.
Absolutely, and I plan on being a thorn in the next mayor's side until that happens and that gets implemented.
Right. So speaking about being a thorn in the next mayor's side, I wanted to ask you a question, not necessarily about homelessness, but we're going to now have the mayoral primary, obviously in June, likely leads to our next mayor in New York City is at a really critical time. And so picking, from your broader perspective of what's going on in the city and your experiences in public service in the city, if that mayor called you in and he or she said, Christine, I want to leave a legacy for the city. I want to recalibrate reality for a better, a brighter, more equitable, more sustainable, more prosperous New York. What would be the three things that I should focus on from a policy standpoint from day one to make my three key priorities to do that? What would you say?
I'd say 1, ending homelessness. 2, really fixing our schools so that regardless of what zip code you live in the city of New York, you have the same quality schools, that everybody has the same resources. Some schools have the ability to have parent associations that raise a lot of money, God bless them, and other schools do not. We can't have that kind of imbalance. And 3, use every resource in the city of New York, whether it's the city's budget, whether it's the real estate industry, Broadway, the tech community, the biomedical community, use them to create jobs for New Yorkers. That's what we need. The Mayor Bloomberg and I did a biomedical tax credit. It's part of why we have an East Side biomedical hub over by NYU and Bellevue. This city of New York buys so much food. The only entity that buys more food than we do is the United States military. Use that contracting power to get some good jobs out there in the food sector for New Yorkers. So if we can get people housed, if we can get children educated, and we can get adults working, we're not only going to be what we were before COVID, we're going to be a million times better. And there's all this conversation, is New York dead? Is New York dead? You can't kill New York.
Right.
You can't kill New York. People just need to stop talking about that. You do those 3 things and we're going to be in a better place.
Right. Well, and I think, to your point, people that, for New York to come back, it's not just coming back, it's that we're going to be able to come back better and stronger. And it's about bringing us all together. And I think that's been part of the challenges over the last number of years, is that it feels like it's us versus them, versus this is our city. And how do we collectively make our city a stronger city? And how is the problem of the 3 problems you said of homelessness, education, and creating jobs is all of our problems, right? It's not just a public problem. It's not just the problems that are the people that have those challenges. It's all New Yorkers' challenges.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, we have to admit collectively that income inequality is out of hand in the city, right? But the answer to that isn't vilification of some, it's creating jobs.
Exactly. But Kristen, this was a great conversation. You've given me a lot of hope, which I appreciate, in this as we go through this. And I think that, a tremendous amount of insights on a topic, as you point out, is a vexing topic. And I think because it's vexing, a lot of people avoid dealing with it. And I think the more people could be educated to what some of the challenges are, as you described them in this conversation, I think it's going to be easier for people to want to engage and try to be part of the solution. So thank you for doing that.
Much. Thank you, and the RPA and 92nd Street Y for doing these.
Thanks, Kristen. Speak to you soon. Be well and be safe. That concludes this week's episode of Recalibrate Reality. As you just heard, we need to break away from the status quo of just managing our homeless crisis and instead put forward bold policies that address the root cause of homelessness and finally end one of our city's greatest challenges. Thank you again to Christine Quinn and the team at WIN. Thank you to the Regional Plan Association, the 92nd Street Y. And thank you to the team for making this week's episode possible. From 75 Rockefeller Plaza in New York, I'm Scott Reckler. See you next week.